This is part 2 of my interview with Carol Gracie, naturalist, photographer, and author. One of my favorite plants that I see in the spring, and I have in my own garden, is bishop's cap or mitrewort, which we also saw.
Right.
And I don't see that for sale very often. It's kind of similar to foam flower, but just different enough to be very interesting.
I think probably because the flowers are so small, you would need a whole clump of them to make an impression. We did see such clumps the other day.
They're beautiful.
But they are one of the most beautiful flowers. You asked about my favorite flowers.
Yes, yes.
And they are less than 1/4 inch across. But if you look with a hand lens, I always recommend that people carry with them a magnification lens of at least 10x. And look carefully at these things because they have such very fine appendages on the petals that they look like a 5-pointed snowflake. They're just the most beautiful flower. And I have tried to buy them. In fact, I was told that I was buying them one time, and it turned out to be a relative that's from the western part of this country.
Oh, okay.
So I didn't get what I was hoping for, but I got another very pretty plant.
And I think the subtleties of some of these flowers, it's very important to appreciate that because a lot of us, are attracted by the big showy flowers, but there can be so much beauty in the foliage of some of these plants, the small flowers. And one thing that we saw, of course, after flowering was hepatica.
Yes.
And I think the foliage is fantastic on that plant.
Is.
Talk a little bit about hepatica and what's native here.
Well, hepatica, again, has a very early blooming flower. I would say it's probably the earliest right where we live. And they come in shades of white to pink to lavender to a deep purple, which is my favorite. And they're beautiful flowers. They're visited by small bees. And then they have, they bloom at the time that their old leaves from the previous year are still present. And by that time, they've often turned a deep burgundy color. And once the flowers have bloomed, those leaves will finally wither, turn brown, and really just sort of decay. But at the same time, the new leaves are emerging. And the new leaves, as we saw the other day, are a sort of bright, almost yellow-green. And they'll darken through the year and get more leathery, which helps protect them. And they look somewhat like a liver. People say I've never seen a real liver, but it's supposed to be lobed, and these have 3 lobes. And that's how it got the name hepatica, which is another term referring to liver.
Okay, okay.
And in fact, there was a big harvesting of hepatica in the southern part of this country back in the late 1800s for medicinal purposes. Much of it was used here in this country, but much of it was sent to Europe. And they've, of course, have done studies since then and found out there's no efficacy to this.
Oh, okay.
This was something that developed from what was called the doctrine of signatures.
Yes, yes.
Where plants had a shape or a color or some other thing about them that was supposed to signify what they would be good for treating. And a lot of people relied on this.
Toothwort being one.
Toothwort another, right? And all of these plants, well, bloodroot was another one.
And bloodroot.
Bloodroot got its name really because the underground rhizome, which is what people referred to as the root, is full of a red sap. Many things in the poppy family, which bloodroot is, have a colored sap, either red or yellow or white in the case of opium poppy. And in bloodroot, it's red. And it was used as a medicinal plant, not really to treat blood disease at all, but to treat things like sore throat. Native Americans used it. They taught the colonists how to use it.
Yes.
And it was used not too long ago, in the early 90s. It was being promoted as a plaque preventative. And you saw it sold with big advertisements showing the bloodroot flower or the rhizome, saying, it's nature's cure. And people think sometimes if it's from nature, it has to be safe. But what they found was that people who used it regularly as a toothpaste or a mouthwash were developing white lesions in their mouths. And they were almost 10 times more likely to develop this type of lesion than somebody who didn't use that product. And some of these lesions are the type that can become cancerous.
Oh,
So,
dear.
of course, they very quickly had to take that off the market when this study was done. But we have a number of friends who are ethnobotanists, which means people who study plants and their uses by man in their cultural history. And one of them likes to try a lot of these things for himself. And he tried bloodroot, just a tiny taste of the rhizome. And he said he developed tunnel vision for quite a long period, after, a matter of hours. So there are many medicinal compounds that we get from plants, but as with all medicines, the amount is what's important.
Yes, it does.
And you really can't just eat anything right from nature and count on it to be safe.
And the other issue with that, if you are into foraging, backyard foraging, or in the woods, just be aware, obviously, that you're impacting potentially a population of plants.
Right. There are places, for instance, even in the Smokies now, where what are called ramps down there, or wild leeks up here, have been over-harvested. And they've now put a ban on that in certain parts of Kentucky and North Carolina.
And we did see, actually.
We did see some wild lamps the other day.
Yes, we did, didn't we?
And I've been in other sanctuaries where people put comments in terms of what they've seen. And I've seen people write at the sanctuary sign-in booth, "Great foraging for ramps today."
Oh dear.
Which, is a little frightening that people think it's okay to do that.
So even though some of our plants are edible, be judicious and...
you might be able to take a few to flavor something, but you can get a lot of flavor just from the leaves and not pull the whole plant up.
Yes,
So, that's a possibility.
Yes. And we did obviously see some woody plants too. Now, we're not focusing on them today, but I think it's important to note that there are a lot of woody plants that are growing in association with these wildflowers.
Right.
And one that we saw that's kind of fun at the stage that we saw it is hobblebush.
Yes, right.
And one of our viburnums.
Right.
That's pretty much reserved for higher elevations, as I recall. But
higher elevations are further north. Higher elevations in the mountains, going further south. It's a beautiful plant if you have the right conditions to grow it. It has big round masses of white flowers, which are then followed by beautiful red berries. And it's got an interesting large leaf as well.
It does.
So that was one we saw. We also saw some of the maples that we don't see down here, like moosewood or striped maple.
Which are very beautiful, their bark.
Acer spicatum, which is, what do they call it? I'm not sure the common name now, but
and we also saw one of my favorite garden plants, pagoda dogwood.
Yes, right.
Which is
I don't
a lovely,
see that in the wild
good
too often.
Understory tree.
Although you were very keen to spot that because
it's my favorite.
Right, many people would not notice that, and many people don't know that there's an alternate leaved or alternate stem dogwood, so they would not think of that when they saw that.
So if you're going to have a wildflower garden, thinking about having some of the structure with some of our woody plants or understory and a canopy plants would be very important too.
Right, it would be.
Yeah.
Start with the basics.
And what else did we see that that might strike your fancy? I'll take a look at our list.
Look at our list.
We saw so many. Let's see. Well, here's one, Lanisra canadensis, that I had never seen in the wild.
Right.
Which was really interesting. American fly honeysuckle.
Right. It's not something most people would think of planting because it has a very small, not fragrant flower. They come in pairs. It's a very, what I would call a cute flower. Little pairs of flowers that dangle. They're sort of small and yellow-green, so not very noticeable. But they remind me of twin flower, the beautiful little Linnea with the pink flowers because of the way they're paired. So that was an interesting thing
I've never
to
seen
find.
that for sale. I'm sure it probably is somewhere, but
maybe in some native plant nursery.
And another one of my favorites I forgot that we saw is Uvularia sessifolia wild oats.
Yes,
Talk
we saw
about that
a lot
lovely
of that.
one.
Yeah. That's something, I actually have some of that growing in my garden, which must have come in with something else I planted. And it is a plant that has small dangling yellow bell-like flowers. There are several members of that genus that you can find.
Great
This
Marybells is another
yeah,
one.
that's a very showy one that gardeners like to plant because the flowers are larger and bright yellow. But this is a very subtle one, and again, it grows in shaded areas. The leaves remain well into the summer. So it, again, can make a nice ground cover if you get a thick enough clump of it going.
And if you give them a chance, they'll get there.
Oh, they do, yeah. Yeah.
And what else? Oh, we saw Sambucus racemoso, a red-berried elder.
Again,
which,
a plant of higher elevations or further north. So this one little pocket that we were in is a little bit colder. We saw Clintonia, for instance, which I'm familiar with up in the Adirondacks or the White Mountains. A number of things that I very rarely see down here. We saw some baneberry.
We did, which is a nice garden plant.
Right.
And dwarf ginseng we spotted almost at the end, which you don't see very often in the wild, of course.
Although I saw some recently just in the adjacent town, Pound Ridge.
Okay.
So you can find it around here, but that has a nice little ball-like clump of tiny, tiny white flowers and three-parted leaves. So it's a very pretty little plant, and I was excited to see that there.
You know a plant geek when we get excited by the very tiny ones, don't you?
It's like those people who get excited by the dull brown sparrows.
And rose twisted stalk.
Oh, I love that plant.
I looked at it and it looked very much like wild mandarin to me.
It does. It has that same structure of the branching leaves. The flowers are dangling underneath like wild mandarin. But there's sort of a creamy color dotted with pink so that they give the appearance of being all pink. Sometimes they're much more pink than other times. And the unfortunate thing about that is that it's a member of the lily family, the true lilies.
Yes.
And as such, it's prone to being eaten by those rather red lily beetles that we have in our gardens. And in fact, I did see it being eaten by,
you
by
pointed
those
that out
last year. I didn't see it this year.
So a lot of our garden pests, the kind of exotic ones, and just a quick comment that only about 10% of what we see as far as insects are concerned, our whole landscapes are actually pests. The vast majority are beneficial. We need to make that point. But some of our pests in the garden are actually now getting into natural areas, aren't they?
They can, and that's a little frightening because it's just another way that our native plants could disappear.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I'm sure those red beetles, they're beautiful, have their role as well.
Yes, somewhere else.
Right, wherever they came from.
And here's a plant that we saw in, of course, just in foliage, which people don't tend to use, but white wood aster, which is a really highly functional plant that we can use for some fall color, white color in the garden, under trees, around trees.
Right, and there are places right in this neighborhood where it's sort of colonized the roadside. Because it really does seem to be deer resistant.
It sure does.
I never say deer proof anymore.
No.
I've learned my lesson. But it's a great plant for woodland, shady areas. And you do get that nice little burst of white star-like flowers in, that's an early aster. It starts blooming in late August.
And a real workhorse. It really can almost plant it anywhere in shade.
And heart-shaped leaves.
Yes.
So it's quite nice.
And I note another one that I was very excited to see was Virginia waterleaf, which I've tried to grow in my own garden with moderate success.
Yeah, I tried it and the deer ate it. I tried it down by the lake and the deer got to it.
That's a really pretty plant. Describe that a little bit.
Well, it's called waterleaf because it looks as though somebody has dropped water spots on the leaf and they've sort of faded out in those spots. Not always do they have those spots. We saw some that were entirely green as well. But that's the origin of its name. And it was just beginning to get some buds on a few of those plants, which come in a coiled inflorescence, very fuzzy. And they open up, they're usually a lavender color. So it's a very pretty plant to have in your garden if you don't have deer.
Well, we also saw a number of ferns. And I think it's probably helpful to point out that that is a useful tool in the garden with some pretty serious deer resistance to plant around some of these tasty spring ephemerals.
Right. Right. The one I've found in my garden that is eaten by deer, and I now spray it, is royal fern.
Okay.
Especially the young fiddleheads.
When they're nice and tasty,
Right.
and we would eat those as well, so you can't really blame
maybe
it.
not royal fern, but
No.
ostrich fern. They
Okay,
don't seem
ostrich
to bother
fern.
the ostrich fern.
Yes. Okay.
Which is a little unfortunate because mine is
You
taking over.
have a lot of ostrich fern.
Right.
It's quite beautiful.
Right. It looks pretty.
Well, any other plants that you can think that we should mention? Maybe Canada Mayflower. That's another kind of lovely,
that is another, as
unappreciated.
You say, workhorse. Right. That can colonize a whole area of the understory. Gets tiny little white flowers. Again, they should be in flower by now. Last week or whenever we were there, a week and a half ago, they were not yet in flower. But I think the leaves, many people call it wild lily of the valley.
Yes.
Or false lily of the valley, because they look like a miniature lily of the valley leaf. And it's a very pretty ground cover.
So don't forget the ones that are simple but do a lot in the garden.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this.
It's been fun reminiscing
lovely,
about all we saw.
lovely talk, and we'll step out in your own garden and just take a quick look at some of the beautiful plants that you have and the beautiful view. All right.
Okay,
Great.
sure.
Thanks. This is Kim Eierman from EcoBeneficial. Thanks for watching. For more useful gardening tips to improve our environment, please visit us at www.ecobeneficial.com.